Kaylee, we can't hear you. We have to just figure something out for a minute to make sure that we did not. Here you go. Try again.
There we go. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me this morning. I've been really looking forward to this, particularly because 2 weeks ago I published a short website looking at the change in the labor market or the recovery since 2007, and that's the sort of information that we're going to cover here today. So I'm going to click off my webcam and turn it over to the slides, and we'll get going. Okay, so as I've been preparing for today's meeting, I've been thinking a lot about all of you, where you're located across the province, the type of work that you do every day, and the struggles that you face as you work to assist your clients in developing connections to the labor market and in your particular town or city. And as you'll see, every city is faring differently. We're going to cover a lot of ground today. First, we'll look at a general overview of Ontario's labor market. We'll highlight how work has changed since the turn of this century. For example, more part-time jobs, more temporary positions, and we'll talk a bit about what has happened in the labor market since the recession. Things like, have we recovered? How have we recovered? Where have we recovered, etc. But before we do that, I thought we'd quickly do a brief overview of what the CCPA does. We're a think tank. We have a national office in Ottawa that's been around for more than 30 years. Our provincial office is located in Toronto. We've been around for only 2 years, but we're growing rapidly. We focus on provincial and municipal issues, and we deliver original and peer-reviewed research. So that means that when I write a report that's, say, 15 pages long, I send it to 4 other economists who write 15 or 16 pages of notes that I have to sift through, and then we put the report together. So it's a collaborative effort, and we focus on income inequality, the labor market, which is one of my main areas of focus, and also the role of government. And increasingly we're talking about taxes as well, and the importance of having a strong fiscal base to pay for the things that we need. So I started with the CCPA about 1.5 years ago, and one question that I have been asked a lot since I started working with the CCPA is, what the heck does an economist do anyway? To be honest, I haven't quite nailed down the answer yet. There are different types of economists, and we study different areas of the economy. So I focus on the labor market, my colleague focuses on provincial fiscal issues. But one thing I can tell you that we all have in common is that we make a lot of charts and graphs. Which means my presentation is full of them. Charts, graphs, numbers. I know that it's late morning, people are starting to get hungry. I hope you brought some snacks with you. Charts and graphs are, just what you need in order to keep you awake for the next hour. But hopefully my passion for numbers will be enough to sort of buoy us through this conversation and the worst of it, particularly because some labor market numbers are really very depressing. And also, if there's a question that you have or something that's not quite clear, please feel free to send the question in, and I'll do my best to answer. This is the first time I am using this technology, so we might have a few hiccups along the way, but hopefully we can get it all worked out. So back to economics. I love this cartoon. It sums it up really nicely. There's an economist on the left side of your screen. He's checking his charts and graphs, and he says, oh, the fundamentals of the economy are good. GDP is growing. We're creating a few jobs here and there. The U.S. economy is picking up steam. So it should be all good in Canada too, right? And then the worker on the other side says, sorry, economist, I'm not earning enough to survive. It can't be all good. And the economist looks down, he checks his charts, he checks his graphs, and he says, oh, you don't need to worry. That's not one of the fundamentals anyway. So I just feel like that sums up my work very nicely. I focus on wages and jobs, looking at temporary jobs, part-time jobs, and how people are actually faring in this economy. And we're finding that this, but I'm not earning enough to survive, is a theme that comes up time and again. So one of my areas of concentration is the labor market. The labor market is something that each of us on this webinar, we interact with in different ways every day. I'm betting that a lot of the stats I'm going to show you this afternoon, they're not entirely going to surprise you, but they will ensure that we get on the same page for a discussion about solutions that if I talk fast enough, we can have today, or maybe we can have at another time. So what's happening in Ontario's labor market anyway? My research has shown that Ontario's labor market has undergone what we're calling a seismic shift over the past 15 years. It's a shift that, though tempting, cannot be blamed on the recession. So it's really easy to say, well, oh, once we recover from the recession, everything will be fine again. But in fact, the shift happened before the recession hit. The recession certainly made things worse, but the structural elements, the structural changes were already emerging beforehand. And it's a shift that has a number of underlying factors. The first is the rise of the service sector in Ontario. This chart here shows the net change in jobs in Ontario between 2000 and 2014. You can see this purple line here is the manufacturing sector. We have lost 300,000 manufacturing jobs over the last 15 years. That's astounding. And those jobs that, traditionally they were pretty decent middle-class jobs have been largely offset by an increase in service sector work. So if you look at the mouse here, you can see these purple lines are all goods-producing jobs: agriculture, construction, utilities, manufacturing, and the blue are all service sector jobs. So we've seen the highest growth in healthcare and social assistance, and the second highest in retail and wholesale trade. The other interesting thing for those of you across the province is that the shift has been felt in every single city, every single economic region across the province. These blue stripy lines, that's the loss in manufacturing jobs, and if you look across the board, every city has lost manufacturing jobs. The blue is other goods producing jobs, mostly in construction, and then the darker, almost black, is service industry. And you can see, if you're up in northwestern Ontario, is there anyone from Thunder Bay, you can see that you certainly lost a lot of manufacturing jobs over that time. You also lost other goods producing jobs, and there's been a few jobs, a slight increase in service sector jobs. But if you go to somewhere like Kitchener-Waterloo, certainly they've lost manufacturing jobs, but the increase in construction as well as other service industries has more than offset that loss. Again, places like Stratford, the Bruce Peninsula, also falling behind, where Toronto has seen some pretty steady growth. So let's talk about the service sector jobs. What kind of jobs do you think of when you think of healthcare, when you think of social assistance, this largest increase? Typically, the sector actually creates some really good jobs, right? You think of nurses, doctors, social workers, all very good jobs. The thing is, the sector is also increasingly creating low-paying, precarious jobs as well. The growing movement for higher wages in the personal support worker industry highlights how the trend is changing, and how wage suppression is becoming more common practice. So one example that I like to give is my sister. My sister's a personal support worker. She works in the healthcare and social assistance industry. She makes $13 an hour. She gets her schedule the day before and actually has to make the schedule herself. She just gets a list of the clients she has to see. She has a car and she drives from client to client and doesn't get paid for the in-between time. She doesn't get paid for the gas that she uses or the wear and tear on her car. So that's just one example of that $13 an hour job being created in the healthcare and social services industry. Retail trade is another example. Here you see this increase in retail trade. And it's an industry that's producing a lot of low-wage and precarious jobs. In fact, it's the sector that has the highest share of low-wage work across all industries, and it's one of the top growing ones in Ontario. So essentially, what we've done is we've traded these middle-income manufacturing jobs for these lower-income trade and healthcare and social assistance jobs, and then a few higher-paying jobs. Of course, there are more nurses than there used to be. There are more doctors across the province. And if you look, it also is a trend that plays out in the data. This chart shows the share of workers earning a middle income actually declined between 2000 and 2011. Unfortunately, the most recent data only goes until 2011, so I could have shown you likely more of a shift. If you look here, let's go to the lower wage workers first. If you go here, in the year 2000, about 46% of people working full-time, full-year in Ontario were earning under $30,000 a year. So you're working full-time, full-year, that's 35 hours a week or more, you're earning less than $30,000 a year. And that, as a share of workers, that increased by 2011 to 49%. So almost half of workers are earning less than $30,000 a year. And that doesn't include anyone who's working in the service industry or the healthcare and social assistance industry that's working part-time. So I believe that this number would grow exponentially if we included part-time workers. If you go to the other side, people earning over $60,000, you can see that there's been a slight increase there. So we went from about 23.5% to 25% in people earning over $60,000 a year. But if you look at this middle income group, the share has actually declined by 4 percentage points, which is quite a bit. I also found when I looked at the numbers that it's not just as a percent of all jobs, we've actually lost jobs in the middle income. So we used to have, for example, 6 million jobs in that earn between 30 and 60,000, and that number has actually shrunk. I can look up that number later and get back to you with that. So the polarizing of the labor market is not the only challenge being faced by workers today. Temporary jobs are increasingly becoming a regular part of life for many Ontarians. I'm sure that your clients are often offered temporary jobs. So since the year 2000, the growth rate of permanent jobs has been quite a bit slower than the growth rate of temporary positions. You can see that between 2000 and 2007, it was growing quite rapidly, and then right before and during the recession, the number of temporary jobs, the growth rate in temporary jobs decreased, and then has shot up again. And look, between 2013 and 2014 in Ontario, we've seen a dramatic increase in temporary work. And temporary work is actually just one ingredient in precarious employment. If we look at precarious work, what does it mean anyway? It's a state of employment that does not have the security or benefits of more traditional employment relationships. So things like temporary work, part-time work, low pay, and no benefits are all symptoms of precarious work. And what we've found, or what some researchers have found, is that in Ontario, particularly in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area, 40% of all workers have some form of precarity in their work. And in fact, many of us on the phone or on the webinar today might have that element of precarity as well as the labor market. As the labor market changes and government and other employers face increasing pressure to suppress wages at the expense of other things. All right, another shift that we can look at is it's part-time work, and part-time work has actually received a lot of attention over the last 6 months. In fact, just back in August, there was a tit-for-tat between a couple of economists, one from Capital Economics here in Toronto and another from the TD Bank. Capital Economics said Canada is becoming a nation of part-time workers. Part-time work is something that we need to be really, really worried about. A week later, TD Economics released a report refuting the statement and attempting to show that even though part-time work is growing, we don't really need to worry about it. So before I tell you the reasons why they think we shouldn't worry about it and why I disagree, I'll show you a few stats. So the growth rate of full and part-time work in Ontario between 2000 and 2014. You can see part-time work has grown faster over that 15-year period than full-time work has. Unlike temporary work, though, part-time work increased pretty dramatically in between 2006 and 2008 after kind of leveling off for a little while, and full-time work actually declined. So why does TD Economics say that this is nothing to worry about? Well, because, you know, they talk about women in the workplace, and women don't really want to work full-time. I know I wouldn't work full-time if I didn't have to. They don't want to work full-time. I think they're wrong. I think lots of people want to be more attached to the labor force. And before I tell you more, let's break this down a little bit. So here's the share of part-time workers by gender. 35% of part-time workers in Ontario in 2014 were men, and 65% were women. That might not be surprising. There are a lot of women who work part-time in order to do more work around the house. Maybe they're volunteering, and likely they're either taking care of children or other family members. So that stat alone might not surprise you, but this one might. Breaking down part-time work by the reason for part-time work, we find that 33% of all women who are working part-time would rather be working full-time. That's actually 10 percentage points higher than it was 15 years ago. So over that 15-year period, for whatever reason, 10% more of the women who are working part-time are doing so involuntarily. You can see here that many women are working part-time because they're caring for children, or there's other family responsibilities. Interestingly, this category for men is very small. Putting the two together, it's about 5% or even less. And of course, some people are going to school, and 27% of the women who are working part-time because that's what they want to do. And that's only for women. If we look at all part-time workers across the province, we find that 34.5% of all people working part-time would rather be working full-time. This chart shows, and it's actually no matter what category you're in. So if you're a youth, if you're an older worker, if you're an immigrant, if you're a woman, all together we see this uptick in involuntary part-time work. This chart shows that over here you can see at the turn of the century Ontario pulled down the Canadian average. The blue line is Ontario, the purple line is the rest of Canada. We pulled down the Canadian average, and now, way over here, we pull it up. And involuntary part-time work certainly skyrocketed during the recession and has stayed that high since, and in 2014 actually increased again. Oh, we went the wrong way there, didn't we? Excuse me. There we go. So another reason, the second reason that TD Economics gives for not worrying about the dramatic increase in part-time work is that it's older workers who are taking the part-time jobs after retirement. And you know, they are only working part-time because they're bored and they want to be doing something, they want to feel productive. So that's the reason. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think it might be true for some people, but there's a growing portion of the population that something different is happening. Before we discuss that, let's just take a look here. The share of part-time workers by select age group in Ontario in the year, this is for the year 2000, and the most important part I want you to pay attention to is this green triangle. In 2000, 13% of people working part-time in Ontario were 55 and over. And then by the year 2014, that increased to 22%. So there's a huge increase there in the number of older workers who are working part-time. And many people, as opposed to just working part-time because they're bored, many people are doing so to supplement their income because they need to cover their basic necessities. So we're not talking about paying for an extra trip to Egypt here. We're talking about food, we're talking about rent, we're talking about gifts for grandchildren, and other things that older workers either want to do or need. And I think some of that has to do with the fact that we don't have the same ability to save that we used to. So the pension, we don't have the same pension coverage that we used to, and people are actually working to supplement their income. So mainstream economists are predicting that we will see an increase in part-time work in the years ahead. But that, again, we don't need to worry about this because more women are going to enter the labor force. Older workers are going to stay in the labor force. So we don't need to worry about part-time work yet. But I think there's another side of the coin here. And part of that is that wages are stagnating. And unfortunately, I don't have a slide for this, but wages haven't increased at all since the recession and have barely increased for the past really 30 years. So families are continuing to struggle to make ends meet, and people are working part-time in order to supplement incomes that used to be earned by one worker. Okay, I'm going to let that sink in for a minute. All right, so far we have a pretty depressing presentation, but let's talk about the unemployed. The people that we've been talking about so far are people that are actually in the labor market already. Now we're going to talk about people in Ontario who are looking for work. And certainly they all face the conditions that I've mentioned above. And you probably are already aware of this, I'm sure, because we work with it every day. The job market is a frustrating place for people to be looking for success. The clients that you work with, they might have dreams of full-time jobs. They want permanent contracts, jobs that suit their desired skill set. But finding that job is likely a real struggle. In fact, finding any job is a real struggle, and getting that job can be even worse. So what does the competition look like? Well, first I can tell you that there are currently about 520,000 unemployed individuals in Ontario. That's almost 100,000 more people than before the recession. And that number is certainly coming down. In fact, it dropped pretty dramatically in the first part of 2014. You can see there it dropped pretty dramatically and rose again now in the second part of 2014. But it is coming down. You can see here, though, if we look at the recession from September 2008 until June 2009, the number of unemployed in Ontario increased by more than 200,000 people. So it rose to 675,000 people. That's a huge, huge number. Again, it's been declining since then, but it's still much higher than before the recession. And this decline is not just that people have found jobs. There are actually many reasons to leave the list of the unemployed. One, clearly, is that you found a job, but another is to leave the labor force because you're sick and tired of trying to find a job. It's demoralizing, it's depressing, and you need to stop and take care of your mental health, or it's just lost its luster. And of course, an aging population will take care of some of this as well. So some people may decide to retire early and start collecting CPP or start collecting their pension early. All right, so let's look at some other numbers here. Long-term unemployment. We have this nasty problem, long-term unemployment. You can see that, as with all the other charts, we used to pull down the Canadian average. Again, blue is Ontario and purple is the rest of Canada. We used to pull down the Canadian average, and now we pull it up. The long-term unemployed is a grave concern for a number of reasons. Again, there are reasons you are likely aware of. It can have a scarring effect on workers. The longer one is separated from the world of work, the more discouraged one gets, and then their skills can be eroded over time. Employers may also see long bouts of unemployment as a signal that a particular candidate is not employable, even though that's not true. So the longer you're unemployed, the less likely you are to get a job. And the third is, how are the unemployed supporting themselves, particularly when employment insurance is so much more difficult to get than it used to be? Are people using their savings? Are people, other family members, working 2 or 3 jobs in order to help make ends meet? Those sorts of things. So I am going to attempt to show you a video. I didn't mention this to Susanna or Raj earlier. I was planning on it and I forgot. So we'll see if it works. And if you can't hear the sound, then we'll just turn it off. But this is a video on the long-term unemployment rate around the world from the International Labour Organization.
In the world's advanced economies, long-term unemployment is a significant problem. In the European Union, an estimated 12 million people have been looking for a job for a year or more. These millions of long-term unemployed risk losing the job skills they have acquired and becoming socially excluded. If unaddressed, the earnings potential for these individuals will be dramatically reduced. A strong focus on labor market policies, including job training, is needed to keep these people in the job market. In developing economies, especially in Asia, the problem is very different. While economic growth has been relatively strong since the global financial crisis, the question remains whether that growth will be strong enough to create the number of quality jobs needed for the millions of increasingly educated young people. Part of the solution is to ensure that labor market institutions are strengthened to get the new generation of younger job seekers and the employers who want to hire them the support they need.
Okay, so could you hear that okay? I hope so. The video talked about long-term unemployment in Europe as well as in developing countries, and one of the solutions was that advanced economies need to invest in education and training for the long-term unemployed. I would argue that we're doing that already, and I'm sure the people that you're working with have participated in all sorts of training. I would say that what we need to do is the same as was recommended for the developing nations, which is to improve labor market institutions. So we can talk about creating jobs, creating good jobs through public investment in infrastructure and also in public services. And by boosting incomes at the bottom, which we'll go into later, in order to increase the amount of money that people have in their pockets so that they can actually spend it in the economy on Ontario's goods and services, thus creating more demand and creating more jobs at the same time. All right. Another stat that I like to look at is the unemployment rate in Ontario versus the underemployment rate in Ontario. These are two different numbers. So first we'll look at the official unemployment rate. That's the number of people who are not employed but have looked for a job in the past 2 weeks when the survey is administered. And the unemployment rate in 2014 was 7.2%. So that's the official rate reported by Statistics Canada. Then we add in discouraged workers, and that brings the unemployment rate up to 7.2, so it brings it up to about 7.4%. And actually, if you look at data from the Bank of Canada, they actually estimate that there are far more discouraged workers than we actually have measured. But that's the official rate that we have. Then we add in the waiting group, and this is a group of people who have been laid off. But are hoping to be called back to work. So they haven't looked for a job because they know they have one coming up, hopefully, but they're not employed right now. So we add those people in and the rate goes up to over 8%. And then we add in all of those involuntary part-time workers, and all of a sudden we have an underemployment rate, so people who would like a different job, and that's only the people that we can measure. We have an unemployment or underemployment rate of 11.3%. 11% of the labor force, at least 11% of the labor force is underemployed. That's a huge number. Some economists are saying that this is a far better measure of unemployment than the official rate, and I actually tend to agree. Unemployment is not the only reason to be looking for work. You might be looking for work even if you have a full-time job. You might be underemployed and wishing that you could be using all of the skills that you have. You might just want a better boss. You might want higher pay. You might want better benefits. So this 11.2% underemployment rate is an indication that the labor market isn't working for many people, but I think there are many people out there that we're still missing. One more measure of unemployment or competition in the labor market is the number of unemployed to the job vacancy ratio. This is something that Statistics Canada started tracking back in 2011. So if we look at this here, you can see that there are 530,000 unemployed persons, or there were 530,000 unemployed persons in Ontario in September of 2013. Again, this doesn't count discouraged workers. It doesn't count involuntary part-timers. It doesn't count anyone who has a job and is looking for another one. But how many jobs are actually out there? I could have made this a polling question. I often ask this question when I give presentations, and people estimate, the estimate is far higher than the reality. So let's see. How many jobs were available in September in Ontario? 79,000. So this is the number of people who are competing for jobs. This is the number of jobs available. So there's 6.8 or 7 people competing for every job available in Ontario. Or put another way, if every job on offer were taken tomorrow, there would still be 450,000 people out of work in Ontario. You know, of course, some churn in the labor market is natural, but a rate of 0 for job vacancy would be worrying. This illustrates the point that there is huge competition for the jobs that are on offer in Ontario today. So these last few issues, involuntary part-time work, long-term unemployment, they certainly blew up during the recession, but the overall shift started before the recession. It's not cyclical, it's structural. The shift was happening before the recession hit. It continues to happen today, but the question is, did the recession exacerbate the problem? Have we recovered? Have we recovered the jobs that we lost? So that depends actually on how you look at things. 2 weeks ago, Kathleen Wynne tweeted that we've recovered all of the jobs we lost during the recession. And that's great. The thing is, it's not enough to have just recovered the jobs that were lost. Since then, our population has grown, and as I explained earlier, many of the jobs that have been created are part-time or are temporary. So instead of looking only at the number of jobs that are created, let's consider the employment rate. So the employment rate equals the number of people who are working divided by the total population for the age group that you're looking at. So I will talk about people ages 15 to 55. And in 2007, the employment rate was 82.1%. So 82.1% of all the people, prime-aged workers, people between 15 and 55, were working. In 2014, that number was 80.4%. So that's almost a 2 percentage point decrease in the employment rate. My question for you, this will be a question for the polls, is how many jobs are still missing? So in order to get from 80.4 to 82.1, how many jobs would Ontario have to create?
Okay, Kelly, I've launched the poll.
Great.
Kaylee, while we're waiting for the poll answers, I have a couple of questions, and I thought maybe this could be a good time to just play the poll. So one question was, can you explain in a nutshell how the unemployment rate is calculated? To help understand the participants how it is inadequate. So for example, does it include those on social assistance, those who quit rather than those who were laid off, etc. So how is the official unemployment rate calculated?
Sure. Okay.
So yeah, if you can maybe, while we wait for the polls to finish.
We're like almost halfway through.
Okay.
Time to maybe scoot out it.
Do you want me to answer that question right now for everyone?
It'd be helpful to just, as we are continuing, just at least briefly, so then we can go into a little more detail later on if necessary. But
Sure.
We're almost like 70% of the votes are in.
Okay.
And there's another question, like, does the stat of Toronto include York Region too? Just, that was another question from Colleen. When you're talking about Toronto stats, Kelly, I mean, does it include York Region, or is it not part of the Toronto stats? That was another question.
Okay.
Just
Do you
so you know.
want me to? Okay. I can answer that when we go back online too.
Okay, we've got almost 80% of the votes are in.
Oh, and I should also let you know that I have to go as soon after 12 as possible. I have another presentation this afternoon that I have to run to. If we go 5 or 10 minutes over, that's fine, but no more than that.
maybe we just conclude the poll.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to close the polls in maybe 10 seconds. All right, well, almost 90% votes in. I'm closing the polls. And the results are in. Almost 50% of them answer C. That's 255,000, followed by 27% of them answered B.
Okay.
Yeah.
And can they see those results?
Yeah, I guess you can see them.
Perfect. Okay, so let me know when I'm back.
Yeah, can you see the polls now?
I sure can.
Yeah. All right, let me close it now.
Okay.
Yeah, you're back.
Okay, so almost 50% of you were correct. We are still missing 255,000 jobs. That's the number of jobs we need to create in order to recover our pre-recession employment rate. Here's a chart that shows those numbers. So this is the 2007 rate. In 2008, we actually saw a slight increase in the employment rate, and then, of course, dropped in 2009, and we had some slow recovery up until 2013. But in 2014, that number dropped significantly, and there will be an update coming from Statistics Canada soon, and hopefully some of that number will be explained. So another way to look at this, I guess, is to look at what's happening across the province. We have this employment rate, which is for Ontario overall, but we can look at the employment rate for each city as well. So that's my next polling question for you. We're going to get the whole quiz out of the way in short order. How many Ontario cities have not recovered their pre-recession, that should say at the end, employment rate? And the total is 14 cities. Before we start the poll, while you're contemplating this question, let's take a look at the list of cities. So these are the cities that I can get free data for from Statistics Canada: London, Peterborough, Brantford, Barrie, the list goes on. Of those cities, how many actually now, or how many cities have not recovered their pre-recession employment rate? That's the polling question. So you can go ahead and open that up.
Okay, the poll starts now. Please respond in less than 30 seconds. Okay, thank you. Okay. That's super fast. We're almost done. Closing in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Wonderful. I got like 90%. I'm going to share the results with you.
Great.
And that's the poll results, Kelly.
I do not see them.
Okay. You don't see them. Anyway, so let me tell you when I'm figuring it out. 51% go with 10, while 40% of them go with 7 cities.
Okay. Okay. So again, everyone, or most people were right. I think 60 or almost 60% said 10. The actual number is 11 because I redid the numbers last night after I sent the poll in. The actual number is 11, but we'll take 10 as the correct answer. Here's the chart that shows the percent change in the employment rate of prime-aged workers in since 2007 by CMA. So you can see Kitchener, Cambridge, Waterloo, true to form, is performing fairly well. Hamilton has a higher employment rate, which surprised me, and Sudbury too has a higher employment rate. Then Thunder Bay is pretty close to neutral. But if you look here at the top, London and Peterborough have been faring very, very poorly, which isn't a surprise. Peterborough has one of the highest, or actually the highest, unemployment rate in the province. And we all have heard the stories about London and the dramatic change that's happened there. One thing that surprised me was Windsor. Windsor certainly has a lower employment rate than they did before the recession, but it's not as much of a change as I thought it was going to be. Okay, so you guys are doing great in the polls. Let's look at the unemployment rate. This is, again, by CMA across the province. And we have a question from earlier that I can address now. The question is, how is the unemployment rate calculated? So the official unemployment rate is calculated through the Labour Force Survey of Statistics Canada. And they phone up and they ask the question, are you unemployed? So have you worked in the past month? And if the answer is no, the next question is, have you looked for work in the past 2 weeks? And if you have not worked but you're looking for work, then that is then you're officially unemployed. That's why someone who's waiting to go back to work isn't included, because they haven't looked for work. That's why discouraged workers aren't included, because they haven't looked for work. And it's why part-time involuntary part-timers are not included, because they are working. So that's why the unemployment rate is so much lower than that underemployment rate that I showed you earlier. And another question that we had is wondering what is included in Toronto. So here on this chart, Toronto includes the whole GTA. York Region is in Toronto. Scarborough is there in Toronto as well, and Etobicoke is included in Toronto too. So I hope that makes things a little bit more clear for you. One more chart looking at what's going on in across the province. You can see the largest share of employment by industry. Just a quick sort of surprising fact is that the manufacturing industry is still the largest industry by employment in 4 places across the province: Windsor, Guelph, Kitchener, and Brantford. But then public administration and other sort of government sector employment is the largest employer in a lot of cities. And you can imagine that if we decided to continue to cut cut government spending, that we would lose a lot of those jobs, and that would actually be a detriment to the cities across the province. Okay. Now let's look at the immigrant population. This is what you've been waiting for, and I'm sure it's not going to be a surprise. Different demographic groups, they're all affected by the shift in very different ways, and it's not a surprise that the immigrant population would be faring a little bit worse and have very different numbers than people who are born in Canada. So you can see from this chart that the unemployment rate of people born in Canada is actually 6.9%. Immigrants who have landed more than 10 years earlier, it's 6.5%. I would guess that there's probably a lot of discouraged workers here that are missing, or also involuntary part-timers that are missing in this category, but I don't have that information, unfortunately. Then you can see that immigrants landed between 5 to 10 years is 11.5%, and the unemployment rate for people who have arrived less than 5 years ago, it's 14.2%. So that's almost as high as the youth unemployment rate, and we continue to talk about youth unemployment being in crisis, and I would say that this is very similar. Also of interest might be wages. Excuse me, so the wages or the median employment income of immigrants who have been here for different amounts of time, arrived 1 year ago. If you're working, the median income is $20,000. So that doesn't include people who are not working. If you've been in Canada for 5 years, it's $25,000, and then being in Canada for 10 years, it's $31,000. And then this actually should not say born in Canada. It should just say Canada overall. The median is $31,660. So once you've been in Canada for 10 years or more, and you are employed, so you're not a discouraged worker, you're not long-term unemployed, then you fare similarly to the rest of Canada. Let's see here. What about the young people? Young people is something that we talk about a lot. Here's the unemployment and underemployment by different age groups. You can see that the official rate is down here. It's that 7.2%. If you look at youth, it's actually 15.5% is the unemployment rate, and then the rate comes down for other older workers. If you add in underemployment, so people waiting for work, people who are discouraged, and then involuntary part-timers, the purple is the underemployment rate, and that's a huge gap between youth and everybody else. It's a huge gap. And it's natural for the youth unemployment rate to be slightly higher than the average, but what we've found is that the dramatic difference is not cyclical, but it's the result of structural changes that are kind of burning their way through the labor market. So there's hiring freezes and there's layoffs, and they all affect younger or newer workers first, people with less seniority. And then to make matters worse, we're seeing two-tiered pay and even two-tiered collective agreements where longer-term workers are paid more and may receive more benefits for the same work than new workers are offered for the same job. And the changes aren't spread evenly across the province. I was going to ask you a poll question, but we're running out of time, so I'm going to skip it, and I'm just going to show you the results. So the question was, in how many cities is the youth unemployment rate lower than it was in 2007? And the answer is 2. So 2 cities have actually seen their unemployment rate, youth unemployment rate decrease. Every other city has an increase. And the 2 cities that have seen a decrease are Brantford and Barrie. The blue is 2007. The pink is 2014. You can see in Peterborough this huge skyrocketing unemployment rate of youth. Peterborough, Kingston, Oshawa, and Toronto all have unemployment rates of at least 17%, and in Peterborough it's over 18%. Windsor, on the other hand, has seen only a very small increase, but they have always been much higher than the average, and it's a city that actually I grew up in and has always been a struggle for people. Okay, here's the percent change in the number of jobs held by youth. So again, if you're thinking about the employment rate, the number of jobs held by youth has decreased in every city except for 2. And again, Thunder Bay is somewhere sort of around even, and Barrie has seen this huge increase. I did call around to a couple employment services agencies in Barrie when I found this number. We thought, you know, maybe a mall had opened or Barrie was utilizing the youth employment strategy in a different way than other cities, but I don't have an answer to that question yet. So if you're from Barrie or know someone who is and have an answer, I'd love to hear your explanation. And finally, here's the percent change in the share of youth who are working part-time. So even though most cities have decreased the actual number of jobs held by youth, most of that decrease has been in full-time work, and the share of jobs that are part-time is increasing. Peterborough, Oshawa, Windsor, and Thunder Bay have seen a decrease in the share of jobs that are part-time for youth, but everywhere else has seen an increase, and this again just shows that youth are having a difficult time in the labor market. And the youth are also facing a couple of other pressures that people 20 years ago, young people 20 years ago didn't face. Tuition, for example, is skyrocketing. This chart shows the increase in tuition versus inflation. So if tuition had increased at the same rate as inflation, tuition would be right down here, and instead it's way up here, increasing 227% since 1993. That's the change since 1993. And you can also see that government spending, or the amount of money, the share of education that's paid for by the government has decreased as well. So that's in 1993. Government paid 79% of the cost of a university degree, while students paid about 17 or 18%. By 2011, let's see, that had changed dramatically, and students now pay almost 40% of the total cost of tuition, while governments pay just over 50%. Another way to look at the cost of education is how long someone has to work to pay their tuition. So the number of hours that a student has to work to pay tuition has actually more than doubled since 2003, from 9 weeks to 20 weeks. You have to work 20 weeks at a minimum wage job in order to pay just your tuition in Ontario. You may think, like, how could this be the case, because the minimum wage has increased, or did increase, particularly between 2003 and 2010, but that's because the minimum wage was frozen or increased at below inflation for almost 2 decades before that. So adding it all up, tuition is skyrocketing, jobs are more scarce, good jobs are few and far between, and people are working more hours to get through school. So no wonder young people are struggling, but actually it's no wonder everyone is struggling. It feels like it's not just young workers, it's people who have lost that middle income job, and they're now, having to they've lost a manufacturing job, and now they have to take a service sector job that pays less, and they're trying to keep up their same lifestyle, be able to pay the mortgage, put their kids through school, et cetera, et cetera. The changes have been very dramatic. And I'm sure everyone can identify with this, either in your own life or in the life of your friends, your nieces and nephews, your children, etc. So that was really depressing. And I hate to say it, but there are so many more charts that I could show you. Unfortunately, we have 1 minute left. The other thing I had hoped to do was have a discussion about solutions. We could talk about raising wages at the bottom. We could talk about mentoring for young workers. We could talk about the youth unemployment strategy and what that has the potential to do, and I'd love to come back on it at another time to talk about those things, but today has been an overview of what's happening in Ontario's labor market, and if I have about 5 minutes to take some questions if there are any before we go.
Thank you, Kelly. There's one quick question here with regards to stats again for Toronto. One of the participants was wondering if the Peel region is included in that number.
You know what? That's a good question. I believe Peel is a part. Well, let's go back here. If you're looking at these numbers for Toronto, they don't include Peel because it's not part of the GTA, so Peel isn't actually in there. It's not a statistic that I can get off the Statistics Canada website without a 3-month ordering process, so hopefully I'll have that information at some point, but Peel isn't included on this chart at the moment.
All right. And another question came from, with regards to the little video that you're showing, asking what kinds of organization is the person referring to as labor market institutions? Do you have that information?
Well, we would talk about labor market institutions as being all sorts of things. So we can talk about government regulation. And, you know, right now we actually have a huge problem with unpaid work or unpaid internships for youth, so something to the effect of decreasing the use of free labor I would say would be a labor market institution that we need to strengthen. We could look at minimum wage rules, also living wages across the province, so governments could become living wage employers. And then we could also look at the types of organizations that create jobs. So once we increase incomes for people at the bottom, it means there's more money in their pockets in order to spend in the province, and that might actually boost private sector employment. Right now, the private sector has not been pulling their weight when it comes to creating jobs, and the jobs are coming from the public sector. We'd like to see both increasing. In fact, the biggest increase in employment has actually been in self-employment. And even someone like my sister who works as a personal support worker is technically considered self-employed because she's on contract. So bolstering those regulations to make sure that people are covered by the Employment Standards Act and those sorts of things would be one way to improve labor market institutions.
Thank you for that. And there's one comment that just came in saying this info makes it clear that our sector needs to look at political choices that are being made impacting on newcomers' ability to engage with the labor market.
I agree. Yeah, there are so many different ways that we can all be working towards sort of creating a better labor market. And I would say that there's a number of things we need to do. One is to help and assist people, and I mean I would include myself in this category, that we all need to do the best that we can in the reality that's here right now. So yes, jobs have low pay. Yes, there's part-time or temporary or free labor. We need to be doing the best. Every individual needs to do the best that they can in the reality that is here. That means, you know, supporting the people that you work with to find whatever job that they can. At the same time, we need to be working to improve the labor market so that the reality is changing. You know, getting a better education is not the magic ticket to a better job. You know, tons of people have great educations, people that you're working with every day who can't find that good job, partially because they're just not available. And so we need to be working on many different fronts in order to both do our best in the reality that's available and do our best to change that reality so that we actually have a higher functioning labor market and a higher functioning economy for everybody.
Thank you very much, Kaylee. I know the time is the essence, so I want to thank you for connecting with us today and putting this presentation together specifically as it, I guess, concerns Ontario and newcomer population we have. We're getting a lot of thank yous and comments about value of the presentation, so we appreciate that. I know you and I already spoke about doing connecting in the new fiscal year and doing an additional part 2, if you wish, to this session. We will announce that shortly. So thank you once again.
Great.
Thank you all for joining us. We will shoot out a survey very shortly, so we hope to hear from you with regards to this, so we can work with Kaylee on the next session, again, in a more customized way. So thanks again, everybody. Thank you, Kaylee. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Kelly.
Bye.
Bye now.